Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're going to give people just another minute to jump on. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining our briefing today. I'm Emily Barson, Senior Advisor at Public-Private Strategies. Appreciate everyone tuning in today for this briefing, timely briefing on the upcoming election for the open Wisconsin Supreme Court seat. Today's briefing is hosted by the Business and Democracy Initiative, a partnership led by Public-Private Strategies, the Black Economic Alliance, and Leadership Now project. The initiative works to educate and activate business leaders on issues related to defending and advancing democracy and democratic institutions. We convene business leaders around issues of interest, like this briefing today, and we provide opportunities to engage on advocacy, communications, and organizing efforts around democracy. And for folks who want to learn more, you can visit our website, businessanddemocracy.org. Just a bit of housekeeping as we get started. Today's event is being recorded, and please feel free to enter any questions you have for our panel into the Q&A box on your Zoom. We are delighted to host this conversation today, so let me introduce our speakers so we can jump in. Mark Solomon is a nationally recognized political strategist and campaign leader, having served as one of the key architects of the marriage equality movement and applying lessons from that effort to other causes, including expanding access to voting rights and voter registration. And he serves as the political advisor for our partner Leadership Now project. Jeff Mandel is one of Wisconsin's leading election law litigators. He founded and serves as both president and lead counsel at Law Forward, a nonprofit, nonpartisan law firm that protects and advances democracy in Wisconsin. And our moderator today is Jessica Cavazos, President and CEO of the Wisconsin Latino Chamber of Commerce, and a fantastic leader who has helped to found numerous organizations that advocate for political activism, civic leadership, and the inclusivity of Latinas in leadership. With that, I will turn it over to Mark to get us started.
Great. Thanks so much, Emily. It's good to be here with all of you. And I'm happy to be talking about the Wisconsin Supreme Court election, which is just a few weeks away. From where I'm sitting, this is the most important election nationally in 2023. And it's sort of unique to be thinking about a state Supreme Court race as being the most important in the country in a whole calendar year. So I want to share with you why, and hopefully in doing so, you'll get, if you don't already, why it is so important. Number one, I think, as everybody knows now, Wisconsin has become one of the 2 or 3 most contested states in the country electorally. It sort of fits in there with Georgia and Arizona as the tightest states in the country. The last 2 presidential elections have been decided by less than 1 percentage point. And it's one of the states that was a 2016 Trump state and a 2020 Biden state. And in all of the states that were 2016 Trump states and 2020 Biden states, it became a hub of what I call the big lie around elections, with efforts to advance a separate slate of unofficial or fake electors. There was a pretty significant lawsuits to undo the results in two of the largest counties in the state of Wisconsin and the like. Unfortunately, those activities have carried on past the 2020 election. There's a real huge divide between the legislature and the governor. Governor Evers actually vetoed 18 bills that were sent to his desk that dealt with democracy, that from my perspective make it harder to vote or would politicize election administration. That's more bills vetoed than any other governor in the country. Because of and there also have been efforts to disband essentially the Secretary of State's position in Wisconsin, which is done in Wisconsin by the Wisconsin Election Commission, which is a bipartisan professional organization. And there were a number of efforts to disband it, undo it, take its powers away and the like. Because of the closeness of the elections and the deep divisions, the Wisconsin Supreme Court plays a role in nearly every issue of serious importance, including democracy. They weighed in on whether the 2020 elections were fair or rigged. And I'm sure Jeff will share with you that there was a 4-3 decision that they were not rigged, but it was only a 4-3 decision. It was the closest decision of any of these in the country, to whether voters should be able to use drop boxes to return their ballots, to whether Wisconsin's state legislative and congressional maps, which are the most gerrymandered in the country, meet state constitutional muster or not. And then just to step away from democracy for a minute, and around one of the most pressing issues and contentious issues right now, as many of you know, Wisconsin now has an absolute ban on abortion from a law that's more than 150 years old, and the court will very likely determine whether that law is constitutional or not. Third, so super close state, Supreme Court gets involved in many, many issues in Wisconsin. Third reason this is such an important race, this is a 4-3 divided court with the conservatives in the majority, and this race will either swing the court to a center-left majority or maintain a conservative majority for the foreseeable future, including in 2024, which is, I guess, as I see it, as likely as not going to be another Trump versus Biden election, with everything that comes along with that. One other thing I just want to comment briefly on the business interest here. Why should business people care about this race? And, what is the democracy interest around business? Well, the Business and Democracy Initiative obviously feels strongly that this is a pressing matter. The business people that we work closely with and that our partners work closely with believe strongly that when the business climate is threatened when democracy is in tough shape. And I work especially closely with a group on the ground called Wisconsin Business Leaders for Democracy. They're active CEOs, both Democrats and Republicans. And they've gotten involved because they firmly believe that business needs a well-functioning, accountable, stable government for the business climate to thrive. And that, if an election results runs on for months without knowing who's in charge, or if there's huge mistrust sowed by elected officials, it's just bad for the business climate. It's bad for the business climate nationally, and it's bad for if Wisconsin in particular is a state where that flourishes, it's bad for the state of Wisconsin's business climate. And as you all know, American democracy is facing some tough times right now. The Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index calls the US now a flawed democracy. It's dropped 10 points from 17th to 27th over the past 6 years. So, you know, we're not in great shape. We all saw the January 6th hearings and the like, and you know, we had some positive elections with respect to democracy in 2022, but you know, we're only one presidential election, or we're not one presidential election yet away from the efforts on January 6th that you know, that were the deepest threat to American democracy in many years, you know, perhaps since the Civil War. Next, and the final thing I want to say is that business leaders are very trusted messengers on this set of issues. We look closely at leadership now at the Edelman Trust Barometer, and that shows that business leaders, more than nonprofit leaders, government leaders, and the media, are trusted messengers on matters of national and civic importance. So, you know, there's a responsibility. People are listening. When people are having a hard time understanding, you know, they see two different sides. They don't know who to believe. Is it Republican? Is it Democrat? A business leader can have a really strong and influential voice because they're trusted as thoughtful and objective. The other thing is that customers have come to expect business leaders to speak out on matters of national importance. In the older days, you know, if you ran Ford, they expected you to talk about cars. Today, on matters of national importance, they expect their CEOs, I mean, employees and people who live in communities expect, you know, the civic leaders, CEOs to speak out on matters of local and national importance. And you know, studies have shown that it is actually good for business, that consumers are more likely to buy a customer's products and services if they speak out on matters of national importance. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to one of the best experts on Wisconsin law and democracy, not just in Wisconsin, but in the country. Jeff Mandel, who founded and runs Law Forward, to share some more.
Thanks so much, Mark, and thanks, Emily, for having me, and Jessica for moderating the discussion that is going to come. I'm really excited to be here. Let me echo what Mark said about why this election is so important and how important this election is, and also note that this, you know, it goes well beyond partisanship. There is an effort to destroy democracy in Wisconsin. It's an ongoing assault on the basic institutions of democracy in Wisconsin. And it's been going on for well over a decade. And part of what is so important about this election is restoring our basic commitment to democracy in Wisconsin and making sure that our institutions work, including our Wisconsin Supreme Court. So I'm going to share this, a few slides, and then happy to take some more questions. Can we flip to the next slide, please? I want to talk specifically, before we get into what's coming next, I want to do a little bit to establish the principle that things here in Wisconsin have been troubled. And I don't want to just ask you to take my word for it, but these slides are from a report that we did here at Law Forward about the Supreme Court 2021 to 2022 term, and how dangerous it was for democracy. And as you can see on the slide, throughout the term, the court consistently chose to take positions, to decide cases, and to interpret statutes or constitutional language in the most anti-democratic way possible, even when there were better, more sensible interpretations. And that's what's so dangerous. If we can move to the next slide. The court has 7 members, and what you see here is a brief, just a brief representation of each of the members. And underneath, you see a series of circles. There were 13 cases about democracy decided by the Wisconsin Supreme Court during that 2021-2022 term. And to give you some context, that was almost 25% of all the cases that the court heard, right? The court hears all the civil cases, all the criminal cases, all the administrative law cases, all of the most important cases that rise to the Supreme Court in Wisconsin, in the entire state. Almost 25% of them last year were about democracy. And so those 13 cases are represented by the little circles you see under each justice, showing how many times they were in the majority and how many times they were in the dissent. And I do want to emphasize that this is not all purely partisan. 3 of those cases were unanimous. And so when you see that some people were, it looks like pretty evenly in the majority and in the dissent, that's not really true, because if you take away those unanimous cases where everybody agreed, what you'll find is that it's pretty consistent who was in the majority and who was in the dissent. I'd also note that at the bottom center, Justice Hagedorn, he was in the majority in every one of those cases. So Justice Hagedorn really is the swing justice on the court. He is quite conservative. He cares about the rule of law, and he cares about rules and norms, but he is himself a deeply, deeply conservative individual and ran a deeply conservative campaign when he was elected in 2019. Let's turn the slide, please. The 13 cases that we saw in last year at the Supreme Court really fall into 3 main categories. There were direct attacks on democracy. I mean, efforts to stop people from voting, to make it harder to vote, or to make our institutions and our government not responsive to the will of the voters. That's what I mean by direct attacks on democracy. There were efforts to consolidate power in our gerrymandered legislature. And as Mark noted, Wisconsin has the most extreme partisan gerrymander in the United States, and we'll get to that in a couple minutes. And then thirdly, there were cases that are just results-oriented judging. That is, these are cases that were brought to the court, and there wasn't a particularly good legal rationale for what the court was asked to do, other than, hey, your political or ideological preferences align with the plaintiff here, and so you should give the plaintiff what they want. And some of these cases fall into multiple categories. So if we turn the slide, you'll see all 13 cases. So these are the 13 cases. And on the right, you've got a little cheat sheet that reminds you who the justices are. And on your far left, you see that we've divided the cases. We've categorized them by the 3 sort of buckets or themes that I just mentioned. And then we explain each case and we show how the votes line up. You can see there that in about a third of the way down the page, you see 3 cases in a row that were unanimous. And note that the first of those, the Sewell case, the attack on democracy was rejected. So there, the court unanimously did something that was pro-democratic. The 2 under that, property tax consultants and City of Waukesha, the court unanimously did something that we consider not democratic. And so again, I just want to underscore that this is not entirely partisan. There's a great deal of hand-wringing in this election about how much involvement the Democratic and Republican parties have in what is ostensibly a nonpartisan judicial race here in Wisconsin. And I just want to assure you that while there is significant partisan identification with a lot of this, much of what the court does really doesn't need to be and shouldn't be partisan or even ideological. And when I talk about things that stand up for democracy, as I mentioned at the outset, I'm talking about standing up for the most fundamental premises of our founding documents, the most basic ideas of our society, and the idea that the government is of the people, by the people, and for the people. These need not be purely partisan ideas. Let me talk quickly about 2 cases of these 13, and then we'll turn to questions. So let's talk about the gerrymander on the next slide. I think most of you know this, but just again, so that we're all speaking from the same idea, the partisan gerrymander in Wisconsin is so strong that in 2018, when voters awarded all of the statewide offices in the state of Wisconsin to Democrats. It was a huge sea change in our government here, where we'd had 8 years of unified control of Republicans. 53% of the votes for the state assembly were for the Democratic candidates, but that resulted in only 36% of the seats in the state assembly. We have 99 seats. Only 36% of those seats were held by Democrats after that. Conversely, the 47% of votes that Republicans got yielded 63 seats. In the state Senate, things were similarly disproportionate. 47% of the votes for the state Senate were for Democrats and yielded only 42% of the seats. 2 years later, in 2020, again, 47% of the votes cast during that election for the state Senate were for Democrats, and yet in 2020, that yielded only 36% of the seats. And 3 weeks from today, when we have the state Supreme Court election, we also have a special election for one Senate district in Wisconsin, and that special election will decide whether there's a Republican supermajority that can override anything the governor might choose to do, or whether we stay just shy of that Republican supermajority. All right. So we brought a lawsuit in 2021 to try to fix this gerrymander. And that lawsuit ultimately failed because the Johnson case, the 4 conservative justices in the majority, who you see there on the top right, they imposed gerrymandered maps that favored the Republican Party explicitly. I mean, that was really the purpose. And the Wisconsin Constitution seeks to prevent that. The Wisconsin Constitution, in fact, says that after each federal census every 10 years, the legislature is supposed to apportion the districts anew. Yet when we brought a case noting that the governor and the legislature couldn't agree, and it was going to fall to the courts to step in and provide a map, what the court did, what the 4-justice conservative majority in the court did in Johnson, was it said, we're not going to apportion the districts anew. We are going to take the old districts that were so extremely gerrymandered. They were the 4th most gerrymandered map that any state in the country has seen in more than 50 years. And we are going to change the lines as little as possible to deal with the changes in the population in Wisconsin. But we're essentially going to bake that gerrymander in for another 10 years. And that's what happened in the Johnson case. That was not obviously the only case. Let's turn to the next slide. Mark also alluded to this case, Tigan versus the Elections Commission. Here, the same 4-justice conservative majority stepped in and made it harder for people to vote absentee. Wisconsin has long had no excuse absentee voting. Anyone who wants to vote absentee can. And yet the court stepped in and made this harder really in 2 ways. First, it forbid drop boxes for people to return absentee ballots. Drop boxes had been used in Wisconsin for decades. They got much more popular during the COVID-19 pandemic, and they were expanded significantly. But for decades, our municipal clerks in Wisconsin, who are our election officials, had been accepting absentee ballots returned via Dropbox. The statutes do not prohibit that. Nowhere will you find the term Dropbox in the statutes, but they talk about what the conditions are in which a ballot may be returned to the clerk. And for decades, people had understood that if the clerk had a secure mail slot or Dropbox you could return your ballot to, that was sufficient. After the big lie, however, as Mark mentioned earlier, things changed, and 2 voters who had never voted absentee and had never used a Dropbox challenged the existence of drop boxes, and the court held in a divided opinion that those drop boxes were illegal. In addition, the court substantially narrowed and overturned not just past practice, but past law in Wisconsin by saying that only a voter themselves can return their ballot to the clerk's office. In other words, when you need to get your absentee ballot back, only the voter should be able to put it in the mailbox, and only the voter could hand deliver it to the clerk's office. This is somewhat absurd. Imagine the circumstance where you have completed your ballot, you have signed and certified the envelope that you are the one who completed your ballot, your spouse or some other adult in your house has signed your ballot that they witnessed you doing it and everything is fine, and you mistakenly leave it on the kitchen counter. So you text your wife or even your kid and say, hey, can you drop that in the mailbox for me? According to the majority in the Tigan decision, you have broken Wisconsin law and your vote shouldn't be counted. That simply can't be correct. And similarly, the court said that no one can deliver your ballot back to the clerk's office. Some people don't want to trust the mail. Some people want to deliver their ballot back in person so that they know it's been received and is ready to be counted. But no longer can you take your ballot and your spouse's, or your ballot and your elderly neighbors. But instead, everyone must take their own individual ballot. This violates federal voting law, which guarantees that disabled voters are entitled to the assistance of their choice. The Wisconsin Supreme Court, the conservative majority, refused even to engage on that topic. We briefed it and I argued it fully in front of the court. They simply ignored it and they said, every ballot must be returned by the person who voted it. We had to turn around and bring a separate case in federal court to get clarification that disabled voters are able to avail themselves of ballot return assistance. And there's still some dispute in Wisconsin and some uncertainty among the 1,850 municipal clerks who administer our elections around the state about what that means. And we're still trying to play a little game of whack-a-mole to make sure that disabled voters everywhere in the state of Wisconsin are able to participate fully. So it is on this basis, and you can turn to the last slide, it's on this basis that I would suggest to all of you that what's happening in our legislature and what's happening in our executive branch are both important, but really it is the judiciary in Wisconsin. And what you see there is in the background is a photo of our actual Wisconsin Supreme Court chamber. That is where the action is right now in Wisconsin. If we are not going to just protect our democracy, which, Mark already mentioned how many vetoes the governor had to use in his efforts to protect our democracy. But if we are going to sustain that democracy and even expand it and make sure that we are meeting the promise of those founding documents and the idea of government of, for, and by the people, it is the judiciary that matters the most right now. And that is why this election is so crucial. So let me stop there and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Jeff. It's an honor to be here today and for the great fight that you both have put, for the civil rights and democracy here in the state of Wisconsin. So, I know we're pressed for time, and I just want to get back into it. Thank you, Jeff, for that. The diagrams and the 101 on the impacts that our Supreme Court has on the state and this election. As we know, the Badger State is a robust ground for civically minded business owners, right? Who are not only, as Mark put it, who are seen as leaders in building democracy and the climate of democracy with their activism as business leaders and involved in elections and supporting the grounds for democracy. So could you tell me, Mark, could you explain the trends and shifts in Wisconsin politics and how it impacts a nominally nonpartisan race like this?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, Wisconsin, well, I guess it's not unfortunate that Wisconsin is a closely divided state. That is what it is, and it's fine. Unfortunately, there's been a narrative that President Trump drove that questioned the integrity of elections that were shown to be just scrupulously run elections in Wisconsin and around the country. And so the dynamic is such that the court plays a critical role in determining, in adjudicating disputes around the elections. And so that's why this race is so hugely important, is that, we could be in the same situation in 2024 that we were in 2020, where, candidate Trump, former President Trump is running, and he loses or he wins by a small number of votes, but he calls things into question and calls the integrity of the election into question. And we need a state Supreme Court that will do the right thing, meaning be impartial and not put their thumbs on one side of the scale or the other. So that's those are the stakes. And it's not, unfortunately, it's not an abstraction. It's Wisconsin went through it just a couple of years ago.
And could you elaborate? I know that you talked about the business climate and how our businesses are really seen now as the leveraging, or I want to say, like, the voice piece of many communities. Would you say that we as community leaders or as civilly minded business leaders have a say on how those votes will turn out, or the turnout of our elections in this race?
I think that the business voice is a very respected voice, and it's respected in part because business doesn't take a position on every issue, and because I'm sure, I don't live in Wisconsin, but I'm sure what you're seeing on TV is you're seeing every different kind of ad, making accusations of one way or the other, and it's hard to just figure out your way through it. And so community leaders, business leaders, standing up and saying, this is what I see, this is my experience, is important. Now, I know there are issues about, business leaders need to draw the line about, how far they want to go. And, in a race, this is nominally nonpartisan, but it's barely. So I get all of those issues, but I think when something as fundamental as democracy is on the line, it's important for business leaders to weigh in.
I agree, Mark. Jeff, what will the outcome of this election mean for 2024, with Wisconsin being a battleground state?
Well, we're going to have to see how things shape up. But what we found in 2020 was that there was a whole litany of litigation in Wisconsin, both about the process of election administration and then about the results. Mark mentioned one case, but there were 4 cases before the Wisconsin Supreme Court. There were 2 cases in federal court in Wisconsin, and there were 3 cases in federal court outside of Wisconsin, all of which sought to overturn the will of the people and the results of the Wisconsin election. Our institutions stood, and all of those lawsuits failed. But things could be very different. We could have, again, I expect that Wisconsin will be a closely contested race in the 2024 presidential, and we should expect that there may well be tries to address that in the courts again. Between now and then, the court will make a number of decisions, both about election administration and about accountability for bad actors who tried to overthrow the will of the people, that will really help shape what that election looks like and how people are incentivized to act in the wake of that election. And so there's just a whole wide range of issues coming up before the court that touch not only directly on our democracy, but could really play out in the 2024 election.
Thank you, Jeff. Mark, why should the business community be interested in this election? And I'll just say, I know you answered that already, but based on what Jeff is saying right now, you know, that this is a battleground state.
Yeah, I think, again, I think it's because there's so much at stake. You know, this is, from where I'm sitting, the most important election in the country this year. Wisconsin is, you know, came one vote away from overturning the election, one Supreme Court vote away from overturning the election, and that is really, you know, that was, you know, most courts ruled unanimously against the Trump challenges. This was a challenge to, you know, seeking to disallow all the votes from Milwaukee and Dane County, which you know, is sort of laughable on the face of it, and it came close. So I think when, you know, our democracy is in difficult shape, and we have the chance to create a Supreme Court, or to build a Supreme Court that is much more balanced, I think it's really important to do it, and to use, you know, I think now is a time to use your voice. I think, you know, I work with this great group of business leaders in Wisconsin, the Florsheims of shoe fame, and several others who are active civic leaders, and you know, and they, you know, even as active CEOs with boards and, you know, publicly held companies and the like, they are using their voice right now because the stakes are so high.
Thank you, Mark. And I know we do have some questions in the box here. It says, regarding gerrymandering, I was around back in the 70s and 80s when Democrats had control of the legislature and did the same in gerrymandering. Why is it different now for Republicans in charge? I think this would be a good Jeff question.
Sure. So it's a great question, and thanks for asking. Partisan gerrymandering, the effort to manipulate the lines so that politicians choose their voters instead of voters getting to choose their leaders, is wrong when anyone does it. It's wrong when the Democrats do it in Illinois next door. It's wrong when the Republicans are doing it here in Wisconsin. I wasn't here in the 70s and 80s, but here's what I can tell you. Partisan gerrymandering has been around for a very long time, and it has been done. But 2011, the gerrymander that was done last decade and was perpetuated currently by the Wisconsin Supreme Court, is the only time since the Eisenhower administration that Wisconsin has gerrymandered through the normal process of the legislature and the governor. So whatever was done in the 70s and 80s, when the Democrats controlled the legislature, did they try to cram through partisan gerrymanders? They probably did. But those maps were ultimately drawn by courts. And whatever the faults of those maps may have been, what I can tell you is that in challenging the 2011 maps, the evidence was presented to a 3-judge federal panel. 2 of those judges were appointed by Republican presidents. And that 3-judge panel, after seeing the evidence, found that the Wisconsin 2011 gerrymander was so extreme that it was unconstitutional. And as part of that, and when I said earlier that Wisconsin had the 4th most extreme partisan gerrymander that any state had seen in 50 years, that is citing evidence that was presented in that Whitford case. Of every state, no matter how long the map was in place, any map that ever took effect over the last 50 years was part of that comparison. And Wisconsin's was the 4th most extreme, going all the way back until the 60s.
And just to add to that, you know, what's happened, and I see this around the country, is that the map drawing technology has gotten so good that, you know, you can, you know, people know what houses are Democratic, like, you know, physical homes are Democratic or likely to vote Democratic, which are likely to vote Republican. And so you put it all into a computer program and it spits out the maps In the old days, like the 70s and 80s, that wasn't the case, and you had map drawers who would do their best at gerrymandering. But now it's become so precise that to the point where in a state like Wisconsin, you can take a state that's essentially 50-50 and make it so that the state legislative maps are more like 33-67.
One question is there any pending lawsuits for the attempt to bring an alternate slate for Wisconsin electors in the 2020?
There is. Law Forward has, we're prosecuting a lawsuit. It's called Pennebaker versus Hitt. It's here in the trial court in Dane County, which is the county where Madison sits, because that's where these folks met. And just to be clear, so that we're, again, all operating from the same premises, when I talk about the fraudulent electors or the fake electors, these are folks, right? Remember that when you vote for president, even though you vote for Joe Biden or Donald Trump on the ballot, what you're really voting for is a group of presidential electors who will participate in the electoral college and cast the state's votes. And the state of Wisconsin gets 10 votes in the electoral college these days. And so the way it works under Wisconsin law is those electors are chosen by the parties or the candidates well in advance, and everybody knows who they are and knows that if the candidate to whom they've been pledged wins, then in 2020, it was on December 14th at noon, they needed to meet at the state capitol and cast Wisconsin's electoral votes. Well, Joe Biden won the 2020 election in Wisconsin. The 10 Joe Biden electors met in the governor's conference room, as is traditionally done. It was live streamed. It was a public meeting, and they cast those votes simultaneously. And with very few people knowing, the 10 individuals who had been pledged to be the electors, if Donald Trump had won, snuck into the Wisconsin Capitol, met secretly in another room, and filled out paperwork designed to make it appear that they were the electoral votes for the state of Wisconsin. And that paperwork said, we, the undersigned, are the duly elected and proper and official electors for the state of Wisconsin. And they mailed that paperwork to the United States Senate. So on January 6th, when the rioters wanted Mike Pence to do something, what they wanted him to do was to count these alternate or fake electors from the 7 states that had cast fake electors, Wisconsin being one of them. That was the whole premise of January 6th, was to put pressure on the vice president to say, throw away the real electoral votes and count these fake votes. There is obviously ongoing discussion about this. There's the possibility of criminal prosecution in Georgia, seems the most likely. There is no criminal proceeding here in Wisconsin, to my knowledge, but we have a civil case seeking to hold accountable those 10 people who tried to steal the value of 3 million votes in Wisconsin, and a couple of other people who conspired to help them do that. It was the first civil lawsuit of its kind in the country. There's now a civil lawsuit in Michigan as well. And we are proceeding, and we're optimistic that we're going to make sure that these folks can never do this again, and that we have clear statement from a court that this is wrong and it is unlawful and it can never happen again.
That is something that I didn't know, and I am thank you for that lesson, Jeff. And I could tell you that that's something that I see when you say that it's an attack on our state's basic rights. That's where it comes to play. I think many of us are going to say that we don't really know what goes on behind the closed doors, right? As far as our electorate. Going on to you, Mark, what specific issues that affect our democracy or voting rights may be brought before the court in the next few years?
Well, I think one, the gerrymandering question is one that is very likely to come back, and the 2 candidates for judge have been quite clear about their position on on the maps. Judge Janet Protasewicz has talked about the maps being really unfairly drawn, and has talked about the legal standard that the court used to uphold them as not based in the law. Judge Kelly has said that it's not really the court's role to wade into this question. So, or at least it's, the way that maps are drawn politically is not a role for the courts to take on. So it's a big difference there. Judge Kelly, many of us were very alarmed when we learned in the January 6th depositions that he was advising the state Republican Party on in the period between November and January 6th, and provided counsel on the question of these fake electors to the folks who were pulling that effort together, the one that Jeff just talked about. Protasewicz has said that the question of democracy is the main reason she's running for judge. She's pretty blunt, and she said Trump won Wisconsin in 2016, Biden won in 2020, and everybody from politicians to judges who tried to change things because they didn't like the outcome should be ashamed of themselves. And I think that's the common sense perspective that it's certainly what I believe, and I think it just makes a lot of sense.
Well, Jeff and Mark, thank you so much. I think this has been a learning experience for a lot of our business owners and myself. I'm going to send it back to Emily Barson from Business and Democracy, and thank you again for hosting this.
Thanks for having us.
Excuse me, to all of our panelists and for the really informative discussion and presentations today. And thanks to everyone who was able to join today. We'll make sure we send around the resources that Jeff had referenced. And I think we will find more opportunities to engage on these issues going forward. This is certainly a really important election, and the issues around democracy will continue to be, a really top priority for our work. And, I think certainly a top priority that we hear from business owners all the time as well. So thanks for your time today, and have a great afternoon. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Everyone.